The Carnegie House in Pittsburgh is often associated with paranormal activity, with many claiming to have witnessed the ghost of Andrew Carnegie, the famous industrialist and philanthropist. Visitors and locals alike have reported seeing his figure on the upper floors, as well as hearing disembodied footsteps echoing through the empty halls. These experiences are often attributed to the house's long history and Carnegie's prominent legacy in the city, which could explain why his spirit is thought to linger in the very space where he may have spent time. The Carnegie House stood eerily quiet on the edge of Pittsburgh, its stone facade weathered by time, yet still imposing. The grand structure, once home to one of America's wealthiest men, had long since fallen into disrepair. Now it sat abandoned, a silent monument to the man who had once transformed the steel industry. But some believed it wasn't just the house that remained. Andrew Carnegie himself, his spirit was said to linger in the shadowed halls. It was on a crisp autumn evening when Emma, a local historian with a particular interest in Pittsburgh's haunted past, decided to investigate. She had heard the rumors for years about the ghostly sightings, the chilling footsteps echoing through empty rooms. Most people dismissed it as nothing more than legend. But Emma was different. She wasn't easily swayed by stories. She wanted proof. As she stepped through the creaking front door, a sense of unease washed over her. The air inside was thick with dust, the once grand staircases now draped in shadows. Emma could almost hear the whispers of the past conversations that had long since faded into history. She moved cautiously, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating old portraits of Carnegie and his family. Suddenly, she froze. There, at the top of the stairs, a figure appeared. Tall, with a broad build, dressed in an old-fashioned suit. It wasn't the faint outline of a ghost that you might expect. It was clear, almost solid, as though the man was merely standing in shadow. Emma's heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. Was it really him? The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching her. Emma took a step forward, then another. But as she did, a soft sound echoed through the house, a tap, tap, tap of footsteps above. She turned toward the noise, her mind racing. There shouldn't be anyone here. The house was empty. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs, as if whoever was walking was coming straight toward her. Emma's pulse quickened. She could feel the temperature in the room drop, her breath turning visible in the cold air. The footsteps were now mere feet from her, yet no one was in sight. "Mr. Carnegie?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, but the footsteps stopped. Emma swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the flashlight. She glanced at the figure at the top of the stairs again. This time, it seemed to be moving, slowly, toward her. Its form was faint, like mist, but there was something undeniably familiar about it, something powerful, as if the very essence of Andrew Carnegie's spirit was still tethered to this place, unwilling to let go. The figure reached the landing just above her, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. His gaze was cold, yet somehow knowing, as if he was observing her, studying her intentions. Emma took a step back, her mind racing with questions, but before she could utter another word, the figure vanished, as though it had never been there at all. The footsteps, however, continued. With a deep breath, Emma followed the sound, her feet almost guided by some unseen force. She crept through the narrow corridors, the echo of the steps growing louder with each passing second. As she entered a room at the far end of the hall, the temperature plummeted. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. A voice, faint but clear, seemed to whisper through the room. "Why have you come?" Emma's blood ran cold. Was it the wind, or something else entirely? Her flashlight flickered once, then twice until it finally went out. In the darkness, the footsteps stopped, and in the silence that followed, Emma heard something far more disturbing than the echo of footsteps she heard breathing. A cold, steady breath, just behind her. She spun around. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she spun around, her breath shallow and quick. The air around her had grown unnaturally cold, the kind of chill that seeps deep into your bones. She reached for the flashlight, desperate to get some light back, but her hands were trembling too much to grip it properly. The breathing grew louder, closer, It was as though someone was standing right behind her. Slowly, she turned her head, half expecting to see a shadow or a fleeting figure. But there was nothing. The room was empty, save for the remnants of old furniture covered in dust. Yet the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. She could almost feel the weight of someone's presence, just out of sight. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning every corner, every crevice. That's when she noticed the portrait. It was hanging crooked on the wall, something she hadn't noticed before. The image was of Andrew Carnegie, his steely eyes staring down at her from the canvas. The expression on his face was stern, almost disapproving, as though he were judging her presence in his domain. The breathing didn't stop. It grew more distinct, now almost ragged, like someone was struggling to breathe. Emma's pulse raced. Was it the house, settling? Or was it something more? She forced herself to take a step forward, toward the portrait. Her hand reached out, trembling, toward the painting. But as her fingers grazed the frame, the air shifted. The room seemed to pulse with energy, and the temperature dropped even further, causing her breath to fog in front of her. Suddenly, there was a sound, a low, guttural whisper. So close she could feel it against her ear. Leave this place, before it's too late. Emma's skin prickled with fear, and she pulled her hand back from the painting as though it had burned her. The footsteps that had been so distant now seemed to be closing in on her from all sides, moving faster, louder. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing, shifting in the shadows. She turned to leave the room but froze when she saw something that made her stomach drop. At the far end of the hallway stood a figure tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably familiar. The faint outline of Andrew Carnegie. His ghostly figure almost translucent but with an eerie presence that filled the space. His eyes locked with hers again, but this time, there was no mistaking the expression. It wasn't just cold. It was furious, as if he were angry she had come, angry she was disturbing his rest. The footsteps didn't stop. Emma's body refused to move, as if caught in some invisible force. She tried to scream, to call out, but her voice was swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence. The ghostly figure took a step forward, its form flickering with an unsettling intensity, as if it was no longer bound to the world of the living. "Why are you here?" His voice echoed in her mind, a deep, resonating force that vibrated through her chest. Her throat tightened, but she managed to whisper, I came to learn the truth. About you. About this house." Carnegie's figure grew even clearer, the outline of his face sharpening in the dim light, his eyes narrowing. "The truth." His voice was cold, filled with centuries of bitterness. "The truth is that some things are better left forgotten." In that instant, the room seemed to close in around her. The walls pressed inward, the air thick with an unnatural force. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the footsteps, now deafening, moved closer, until it felt like they were coming from every direction. She felt the presence of the spirit growing stronger, suffocating. "Leave before you too become part of my history," the ghost of Andrew Carnegie warned. His figure now standing directly before her, looming over her like a specter of the past. Emma took a step back, but the hallway stretched longer, farther than it should have, as if the house itself was rearranging, trapping her inside. The temperature dropped further, her fingers numb and stiff. The faint flicker of light from the flashlight failed one last time, plunging the room into total darkness. And in that darkness, Emma felt the unmistakable pressure of unseen eyes watching her every move. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, everything stopped. The footsteps faded. The coldness lifted. The oppressive air was gone. Emma blinked, trying to steady herself, her heart still racing. She stood in the same room, the same hallway. Had it all been a hallucination? A trick of the mind? But when her eyes returned to the portrait of Carnegie, she saw something that made her blood run cold. His eyes were no longer cold and disapproving. They were following her. The breathing, once again, was at her ear. And she realized, too late, that the house had claimed her. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she slowly turned to face the figure in the painting once more. His eyes, once cold, once piercing, were now locked on her, as though they saw right through her, into her very soul. She stumbled backward, her pulse pounding in her ears. The air around her was thick, stifling, like the walls were closing in. She tried to breathe, but her lungs felt heavy, as if the very atmosphere of the house was pressing down on her. The sound of her breath, shallow and ragged, seemed out of place in the silence that enveloped her. The footsteps, once distant, were now everywhere. Above her, below her, behind her. They moved in a pattern, methodical, deliberate. Slowly, steadily, they seemed to encircle her. Emma's hands gripped the flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white, but no matter how she swung it, the beam of light could not escape the shadows. "Please stop," she whispered to the darkness, her voice barely audible. The footsteps didn't stop. Instead, they grew louder, closer. It felt as though the entire house was alive, as if the building itself had become a breathing, sentient thing. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, groaning under the weight of something unseen. The walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm of their own, a heartbeat that echoed in time with the footsteps, with the breath, with the overwhelming presence that surrounded her. And then, the whisper came again. Only this time, it wasn't faint. It was clear, sharp, and it sliced through the air like a knife. "You're not welcome here." Emma froze, the words reverberating in her chest, as though they had come from deep within the house itself. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, as though reaching for her, pulling at her, trying to claim her. Suddenly, the lights flickered, briefly illuminating the room in harsh flashes before plunging her back into darkness. For a split second, Emma thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye, something tall and imposing. She spun toward it, but the shadow was gone before she could focus on it, leaving nothing but a lingering feeling of dread. The house groaned again, louder now, as if reacting to her fear. The walls seemed to tremble, and Emma could almost hear the whispered words of the past. Voices that had once filled these rooms, now long silenced. But now, those voices were not of the living. "You must leave." The voice was no longer a whisper, it was commanding, urgent, its source undetermined. It was the voice of the house itself, of everything that had ever happened within these walls. And then, through the dark, Emma saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a faint glow appeared, like a candle flickering in the distance. She knew she had to move toward it, to escape whatever had been awakened in this place. But as she started toward it, the footsteps began again, faster, louder, more frantic. The shadowy figure at the top of the stairs reappeared, moving swiftly down the staircase with unnerving speed. Emma's breath hitched as the figure grew closer, its form clearer now. It wasn't just the spirit of Andrew Carnegie, but something more, something ancient, tied to the very bones of the house itself. The figure stopped in front of her, blocking her path. "You are not meant to know the truth." The voice came from the figure now, Andrew Carnegie's face distorted by something darker, something that no longer resembled the man who had once walked these halls. Emma took a step back, her heart racing as she searched for a way out. But the house had shifted. The hallway was longer now, stretching farther than it ever had before. The exit was nowhere to be seen. The footsteps continued. They were no longer just a sound, they were now a presence, a weight in the room, as though the very foundation of the house was made up of them. And then the figure took another step forward. The air grew colder still, her breath now fogging in front of her. The cold was seeping into her skin, into her very bones. Emma felt her vision blur, the world around her spinning, her thoughts growing foggy as if the house itself was feeding off her fear. The shadowy figure was now so close she could feel the chill radiating from it. "You should not have come," the figure said, its voice deep, gravelly, as though it came from a place far beyond the grave. Emma tried to speak, to explain, but her voice failed her. Her throat was tight, the words stuck inside her. Her mind raced. There had to be a way out. She couldn't stay here. She had to escape. But the house, the figure, the presence, it all seemed too powerful, too overwhelming. Suddenly, the room seemed to spin. The walls warped, the floor tilted beneath her feet. She was no longer sure what was real, what was part of the house, and what was part of the ghostly world she had stepped into. And then, just as she thought she might fall into the abyss, the shadowy figure spoke again, the words sending a jolt through her. "You will stay, like all the others." Emma's world went black. When she awoke, she was alone. Emma's eyes fluttered open, her head pounding as if the very house was echoing in her skull. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, as though they had been bound by invisible chains. She blinked, her vision slowly clearing, and for a moment, everything seemed still too still. The room was dimly lit, the faint glow from an unknown source casting long shadows across the floor. It wasn't the hallway where she had last seen the shadowy figure. It was a room she hadn't seen before, one she could not place in her memory of the house. The walls were bare, the floor cold and dusty beneath her. A single window, covered in grime, allowed only a sliver of moonlight to filter through. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She was no longer standing in the grand hallways of the Carnegie House. She was somewhere else, somewhere hidden within its heart. A place meant for no one but those who had crossed the house's threshold in search of answers. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. The silence answered her with only the soft creak of the house settling, as if it too was watching her, waiting. She pulled herself to her feet, the room spinning slightly as she steadied herself. As she moved to the window, her eyes were drawn to the faint reflection in the glass there. Behind her, the shadow of a figure. She spun around, but there was no one there. Only the empty room, the dust, and the silence. But the feeling of being watched, of something breathing over her shoulder, was unmistakable. Her heart raced again. Was it him? Was Andrew Carnegie's spirit still here, lingering in the walls? "Leave this place, before it's too late." The words rang in her ears again, the warning echoing through her mind. She turned, her gaze sweeping the room. There was no obvious exit, no door that led out. The space seemed to go on forever, stretching and shifting in ways that felt impossible. But then, in the far corner of the room, a faint glimmer caught her eye, a small door, tucked behind a heavy curtain, barely noticeable in the dim light. Desperation clawed at her, and she moved toward it, her legs shaking beneath her. She could still hear the faint, distant sound of footsteps echoing throughout the house, but now it was different. The footsteps were no longer the sound of a ghostly presence, they were her own. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she grasped the cold brass handle. For a moment, she hesitated, wondering if opening it would release her from the house's grip, or if it would pull her deeper into its dark embrace. But she had no choice. The presence, the house, the figure, it was all too much. She had to leave. With a sharp turn of the handle, the door creaked open. A gust of wind hit her face, sharp and cold, as though the door had opened to a world beyond time itself. She stepped through, and the world seemed to shift around her. The house, the entire house, seemed to groan, as though it were alive, angry that she had chosen to leave. As she stepped into the new space, Emma gasped. The house had changed. She wasn't standing in the room she had just been in. She wasn't even in the Carnegie House anymore. She was in a vast, empty field under a starless sky. The ground beneath her was uneven, cracked, and dry. The only thing in sight was a dark, looming figure in the distance, standing atop a hill. Her pulse quickened. It was him, Andrew Carnegie. But this time he wasn't just a ghost. He was different. His figure was larger than life, his silhouette towering against the horizon. His once stern, disapproving face was now warped, twisted by the very essence of the house's curse. "You can never leave," the figure boomed, his voice shaking the very ground beneath Emma's feet. It wasn't a voice that came from the man he had been, but something far darker, something ancient, fed by the house's history and its secrets. Emma's breath quickened as she took a step back, fear flooding her veins. She realized, with a sinking heart, that she wasn't standing in a field at all. The landscape around her was nothing but an illusion, a reflection of her own mind. A twisted version of the world she thought she knew. The footsteps, once echoing through the house, now surrounded her, closing in on her from every direction. She could feel them, feel the weight of them pressing down on her, suffocating her. The figure on the hill began to move toward her, each step a thunderous boom that shook the ground. "No," Emma whispered, panic flooding her chest. "I have to escape." But she couldn't run. She couldn't move. The world around her warped, distorting as though it was trying to consume her whole. Her eyes darted back toward the door, the only exit. But as she turned, it was gone. The door had vanished, as though it had never been there at all. And then the figure reached her. "You're a part of it now," Carnegie's voice echoed, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. His hand reached out, cold and unfeeling, brushing against her cheek. "All who come here, all who seek the truth, are doomed to stay forever." Emma screamed, but no sound came out. The house had claimed her, and as the last of her consciousness faded, she understood. The truth was never meant to be known. Some secrets were too dark to be uncovered. Some places were never meant to be explored. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story.